All right, viewers, Assalamu alaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Good day and welcome to another edition, special edition of Global Arena on my YouTube channel, Global Arena TV. I'm your host, Umar Isa Dandago. Well, on today's Intercontinental Panel Interview, we are going to scrutinize an issue that has been making lots of attention-grabbing headlines and analysis, especially in the Western world. I am simply referring to the politics of populism. For years, we have seen the rise of populism and populist leaders and movements, especially in Europe and the United States of America. Brexit in 2016 and the election of Donald Trump were two of that year's typical examples of populism. Of course, there are other examples all over the world, and my guests today will try and do justice to the topic in the course of the program. While populism can be seen as a response to dissatisfaction with the status quo, its emphasis on the quote-unquote us versus them rhetoric, its tendency to oversimplify complex issues, and its potential to erode trust in democratic institutions raise concerns about its long-term impact on democracy. So the million-dollar question we're going to be asking is populism a blessing or a threat to democracy, or is it just another complex and complicated issue in which the less we know, the better, as experts say? Well, to painstakingly dissect these issues one after another, I've got three professors from three different continents. Professor John Edward Phillips, an emeritus American professor of history at HIROSAKI University. Then I've got from the UK, I've got one of Europe's biggest and most famous experts in the issue of populism. Professor Daniele ALBERTAZZI is an Italian professor of politics at University of Surrey. To the co-director of the Center for Britain and Europe, author of Populism and the Italian Crisis. Professor ALBERTAZZI, thank you for joining us for the very first time on my show.
Oh, it's my pleasure.
All right, from Nigeria, I've got Dr. AMINU HAYATU, who is a political scientist, diplomatic commentator, currently doing his fellowship in Abuja at the city of Kano. He's also a senior lecturer at BAYERO City, Kano. Dr. AMINU HAYATU, thank you very much for joining us.
Yeah, it's my pleasure for having me.
All right, I'm going to start briefly with some basics. Professor John Edward Phillips, briefly, how do you define populism?
I'm not sure I do define populism. I always have trouble understanding what people mean when they say populism. The term comes from the People's Party in the 1890s in the United States. Was basically a farmers' movement. They wanted inflation. They were heavily in debt because of the modernization of agriculture. They had to purchase continually improved equipment, expand their land, and the more food they grew, the less money they made because they were so productive. They did have a number of other demands and an eclectic mix of right-wing and left-wing ideas. They advocated an income tax, direct election of senators, postal savings banks, government ownership of transportation and communications, temperance. They were opposed to alien land ownership and they wanted immigration restrictions. It was very much a movement of nostalgia for the traditional American social structure. It was most successful in the rural parts of the United States, especially the Great Plains and the South. They did try to attract urban workers, but with little success. Inflation in particular was their number one demand. They wanted it, and it was something that would hurt industrial workers who were on a fixed wage. In the 1896 election, presidential election, they supported the Democratic candidate William Jennings Bryan and basically fused with the Democrats. Essentially ceased to exist except as an influence in the Democratic Party. Now, again, they were an influence on both the right and the left, and this is how both Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders in the United States get labeled populists. A little difficult to categorize them in traditional political terms. In North Carolina, they had been fusing with the Republicans, and they started out creating black and white political alliances in the South, which threatened the white power structure. Because they were organizing across class lines. One of the ways they were suppressed was with black disenfranchisement in the 1890s and lynching. A lot of people don't realize that formal legal segregation in the United States wasn't an immediate thing after the American Civil War. It was a response to populism in the 1890s, and the last black in the U.S. Congress in the 19th century actually left Congress in after the election of 1900, when the black vote in North Carolina was suppressed. And it was over 20 years before another black was elected to Congress. But yeah, the segregation, formal legal segregation, and the disenfranchisement of blacks and lynching really began in the 1890s. And it was a response to this populist movement and an attempt to crush it.
Are you saying that populism emerged out of those problems that were prevalent in the United States of America at that time?
Well, yeah, what we call populism in history, it's not necessarily the same as populism today. What we call populism in history was this People's Party, third party movement in the United States that was essentially a farmers' movement that had left-wing and right-wing elements that began trying to build cross racial alliances, but which wound up being absorbed by the Democratic Party. Again, on both the left and the right of the Democratic Party.
Okay. We have got to understand from your explanation that both the Democrats and the Republicans have elements of populism. We will talk a lot about that, especially with regards to Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump. Daniel Albertazzi, Professor, let me come to you. These years there has been a lot of rise in populist movements in Europe, Brexit in 2016, recent election of Giorgia Meloni in your country, Italy, the recent election of the Dutch Prime Minister, this guy, Geert Wilders. I mean, why is it that Europe has been recently characterized with populism? Professor Daniel Albertazzi.
I wouldn't say it's just Europe. If we move away from a discussion of the historical background, which is what started the discussion, and think about populism as a kind of, if you want, a simplistic ideology, but nonetheless an ideology which pits the existence of an elite always against homogeneous and united people. I mean, what are posited to be, what are said to be homogeneous and united. Then in this case, we can see that this ideology is actually thriving, not just in Europe. I mean, we've had several examples of left-wing populism, for instance, in South America. We've had, of course, the emergence of Donald Trump, and especially the speeches written by Steve Bannon for Trump contain, arguably, at least I would argue, contain a certain degree of populism.
So was it Steve Bannon? I'm sorry to cut you off. That wrote a speech to Donald Trump, which suggested that they would build a wall between the U.S. and Mexico had to pay for the wall. Was it Steve Bannon?
Donald Trump is not just populist; he's also a radical right leader. So there is also quite a huge amount of nativism and authoritarianism in his speeches. So I would say the wall is more an aspect of his nativism. But when Donald Trump talks about the swamp in Washington and says that this election, and I'm talking about his campaign in 2016, for instance, is not just another election is a turning point in the history of the United States, because this is the last chance for the American people to regain power from a corrupt elite that is basically robbing them, not just of their wealth, but also of their identity, their way of life. When he says these things, it seems to me that he's drawing quite heavily on the populist kind of book of tricks, if you want. And the wall and the banning people from predominantly Islamic countries from entering the United States, this is more a kind of an aspect of another ideology that Donald Trump embraces, which is nativism, which is another simplistic ideology which basically says that every foreign element is a threat to the identity of the nation you are claiming to defend. So people from outside, but also cultures, ideas, they're all a threat. Going back to Europe, if we look at what some scholars call neopopulism, so it starts growing really in the 1970s in Europe. You find some anti-tax movements in Scandinavia, some in Northern Europe first, and then it spreads all across the West and indeed the Central and Eastern European countries that, as we know, after the fall of the Berlin Wall, one step at a time start joining the European Union. And even when we think, you mentioned Meloni, but Meloni is just the last in a very, very long series of populist leaders that have been successful in Europe in the last 30, 40 years. Starting with Le Pen, who founded a very successful populist radical right party in France, which was then taken over by his daughter. But then not to mention, of course, a populist paradise like Italy, in which nowadays 2/3 of the electorate choose parties that contain a quite high degree of populism. But as we go through the continent today, we can do this if you want. You'll find that it's much harder to find a country in which there isn't a fairly important populist party than it would be to find one in which there is. And in fact, increasingly in Europe, you find even that there are more than one populist parties in the same countries, not necessarily left and right. This can happen, right? So look at the example, for instance, of Spain, Podemos and Vox. But also very often several populist radical right parties competing in the same system. Italy, again, is an obvious example because of the League and the Brothers of Italy. But there are others. The Netherlands is another very good example. So what I'm saying is not only populism has spread, but different varieties of it have spread in Europe today.
Okay. So it's much more complicated than we think, because you said there are different varieties of populism. I know Professor Albertazzi is leaving maybe in the next 20 or so minutes, 15 minutes probably. I'll ask you a very important question later when I come back. Is populism in Europe about Islam, anti-Muslim? Because most of the populist leaders in Europe, like the Dutch populist guys and those in Northern Europe, are anti-migration, anti-Muslims, anti-Islam. I'll ask you this question later. Dr. AMINU, briefly, what can you say about populism in Africa, and particularly in Nigeria? Is it an issue quite here? Because I normally don't get to hear this terminology, populism, in the news here in Nigeria. What can you briefly say about it?
Well, as you know, Africa and Nigeria, indeed, democracy is still evolving, and of course, with a lot of hitches along the line, back and forth, and so on. So it's really very difficult to clearly define, the way that people think about populism, and it's not really even in terms of the academics. Academics normally sometimes give direction to what is practically obtainable, in the field. But even among academics, you don't get to hear the issue about debate on populism and so on, because sometimes the practices on ground really inform the thinking and debate also in the academia. So the common man in Nigeria or in Africa does not really think about. Probably there may be some pockets of activities or thoughts or actions, as against elitist positions, uprisings, protests and so on. Which are all elements of populism, but not strictly defined and with conscious understanding, by the practitioners. Is the fact that they are doing what they are doing is populism. Let's even alone, thinking about it, whether it's a right-wing populist or left-wing populist or centrist populist and so on. So this really, it's an essentially contested concept, in Africa, and it's still evolving. And people are not getting to think about it because democracy itself is not very ripe and stable in Africa, to the extent that, people will begin to categorize, this kind of political horseshoe, philosophical understanding of the political arena in Africa. And yes, but of course you get to see, for example, the last time there was NSAS protest in Nigeria against, police brutality. You recall that, youth in Nigeria actually rose up against the Nigerian state, protesting against the brutality of the police.
Okay.
An element of populism, but not defined in the sense, philosophical sense of populism. And there are other similar activities by the masses, the anti-government stance, anti-government policy stance that people take, collectively. But even the formation and evolution of political parties is not in terms of this really strict conscious sense of populism in Africa and indeed in Nigeria. And of course, you will also see that even in terms of the foreign relation between the African, most of the African states and even Nigeria, is mostly, there isn't much reflection of the thoughts of populism, in some of these diplomatic relations that Africa or Nigeria have with other external actors in the international system, which is very important. Finally, on this point, I would refer you to, there was a time when head of Department of Political Science in BAYERO University, Dr. Bala Mohammed, wrote a book. It was during the Cold War, Africa and Non-Alignment. It's really about the study, the foreign relations of African countries, with other international actors at the global stage. And in that, because it's a study in the foreign relations of new nations, he has actually been able to articulate that there isn't much reflection of the decision of the masses, of the people, of the common people in Africa in the foreign affairs of their countries, which actually affect them directly. So this is to give you, and since then, up until now, there isn't this very conscious thought and actions about populism in Africa and indeed in Nigeria.
All right, Dr. Aminu.
We were just thinking aloud about whether populism is the right label for some of the parties and leaders that I mentioned, like the League or Brazzavitani. And I was just saying that even those who use the term do not necessarily suggest that populism is the most important ingredient in the ideology of these leaders and parties. There is a kind of radical right element, which is very important.
Are you saying that populist leaders or leaders that are thought to be or that are seen as populist don't like the label of populist? It's more of an offensive word and that they don't like to be called populist leaders or politicians?
It wasn't the topic we were discussing, but it is absolutely true what you say, that few populist leaders embrace this definition. Although there are some that do. An example is Salvini of the League. I mean, he even founded an online magazine called Il Populista, and he's kind of embraced it because he basically what he says is, if populism means being on the side of the people, then I am a populist. And of course, populism doesn't mean that. But another one who doesn't dislike the term is actually Steve Bannon. He said more than once that he's quite happy with it. What we were saying is the fact that some of the parties we mentioned are not just populist. I mean, populism is a very thin ideology. Even people like me who use the term, we don't argue that it explains very much. When you talk about this opposition between elites and the people, I mean, you know, it's hardly a program for government. So what happens is that populism always goes hand in hand with other ideologies. It's very rare you find it on its own. So it could be socialism, or it could be the radical right. So when you look at even the parties in Europe, with perhaps one or two exceptions, the gray majority are not just populists, but are many other things alongside being populist.
Okay, Professor John Edward Phillips, is Donald Trump comfortable to be called populist, and Bernie Sanders as well? Are they comfortable to be called populists?
That I can't answer for you because I can't speak for either of them. It's hard to tell what Trump really stands for because he is so mercurial, and it's hard to pin him down. He'll deny he said something even when they've got tapes of him saying it. He seems to be more and more getting out of touch with reality. Sanders is probably more comfortable with it. Most of the socialists joined the Democratic Party, but a significant number of them went into the Socialist Party. Now, the Socialist Party was another third-party movement in the U.S., not as successful as the Populists, but it's a tradition that Bernie Sanders very much identifies with in calling himself a democratic socialist. And he definitely identifies most strongly with Eugene Debs, the perennial Socialist Party presidential candidate, who was one of the people who came out of the Populist Party and then went into the Socialist Party as a different third-party alternative. Okay.
The question that I want to ask you is the same as I started earlier, talking about populism versus anti-Islam or anti-Muslim. Yeah. Does populism in Europe mean anti-Islam, anti-Muslim, something like that, anti-immigration?
So we have the populist right and the populist left. The populist right is actually much more widespread in Europe. And it is true that after September the 11th, so you can say in the last 22 decades or so, the issue of Islam has gained importance. What I wanted to suggest earlier is that these parties have not been created necessarily after September the 11th. Many of them predate this event. So they are very good at identifying a number of enemies that they argue are the enemies of the people. Let's take the example of Italy. In the 1990s, there was a period in which the Albanian state was collapsing, and the League was actually focusing very much on the threat they said Albanians posed to Italy, because many of them were trying to move to Italy. Then as migration from Africa increased, because now a very important part of the workers in the industries of northern Italy are, in fact, coming from Africa. As this happened, the League focused then on African migrants. After September the 11th, the main enemy became specifically Muslims. So religion, that hadn't been really an issue, an important issue before, took center stage. So what I'm suggesting is these parties are very good at politicizing issues, and they focus on different groups depending on how things develop. So yes, you are right. At the moment, for many of them, the issue of Islam seems to be quite paramount. It's not just September the 11th. Let's remember also the emergence of Islamic State and all the terrorist attacks in various European countries. But it wasn't like this 30 years ago, and we could, as things progress and develop, we could say it's very possible that their enemies 5 years down the line will be different. But what is always the case is that the populist radical right always targets groups in society and identifies them as enemies of the people. It's just that these groups can change.
Is it fair to say that Europe doesn't like Islam and Muslims?
Certainly the issue of religion has been politicized enormously. I wouldn't say that, I wouldn't generalize and say that nobody likes Muslims. There is also a reaction in society with a lot of charities, left-wing groups, or even religious groups like Catholics, who basically say we should really live together happily because we can find a way to live together. So it's not, I wouldn't say it's across the board, but it is true that this issue, especially the so-called clash of Christianity with Islam, has been politicized a lot in the last few years. So it's become very important on the political stage.
Professor Daniel Albertazzi, we have to leave you there. Thank you very much for,
Thank you for hosting me.
Nice
in this program. I hope you will one day come back to talk about your book titled The Italian Populism and the Italian Politics. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. And I'll see you again.
All right, see you. Thank you very much. Dr. Aminu Hayatu, you heard what Professor Daniel Albertazzi said, even though he had to leave because he has another meeting. Looking at rhetorics coming from populist leaders in Europe, for example, Geert Wilders, who has recently won the Dutch election. He, in 2016, was interviewed by Nuala Mugavran. She's a BBC journalist. She interviewed him, and he said that, and I quote, Islam and democracy, Islam and freedom are simply incompatible. These are his words. These are his words. As a Muslim and a political scientist and international relations who has taught courses like Islamic political institution, how would you react to such statements? Is it true that Islam and democracy are simply incompatible, to use Geert Wilders' words?
Well, I think basically it's a question of understanding, and of course it's a question of worldview also. But generally you could say that incompatibility, is context based. It all depends on which context that is being talked about. But I know generally the compatibility depends on the level of, society's stability, government's accountability, to its own people. Most of the time, democracy, not only Islam, cultures across the world, and even some of the societies that are dominated by Christianity also feel that it's incompatible with democracy, simply because for the common man's view, democracy should be about a service to the people, and a reflection of the people's wishes and caprices, in government. When people don't get that, I think that they have the right to think that there is incompatibility there. But generally, in the intellectual sense, I don't think that the two are totally incompatible. It all depends on what plays out. Because if you say democracy, well, democracy where? Because the democracy that is being practiced in the United States of America is different from the one that is practiced in Europe. Even in Europe, the Eastern Europe is practices something different, from other parts of Europe. And if you come down to Africa, democracy is defined differently and is viewed by people differently. If you go to Asia, it's a different thing. So compatibility is a context-based question, and I think it would be an oversimplification of the matter to just say that they're incompatible. But going back to the thoughts about in the philosophical sense, I mean, there are settings that actually their culture and their heritage is originally not compatible with democracy, but what they try to do is to contextualize, and make relevant their culture, reflect their cultures and heritage, in the democratic package which they have chosen to practice. We see, I could remember there was a time in Malaysia when some group of Nigerian students went, to the authorities of a particular university to complain about their own situation. And they went there as a union, and the answer they got was that you guys go home, there's no groups here.
Okay.
But those who told them that were chosen by the people in a democratic, through a democratic sort of project. So the compatibility depends on some of the provisions. Like in Islam, there are certain things that are prohibited, which are allowed in democracy. And currently in Nigeria, we have this tension, even in the constitution, because the Sharia, has a lot of contrast with the civil law, and a lot of the issues, the levels of the colleges and even the judicial, hierarchy differentiates between that of the civic and the Islamic. So a lot of issues actually, reflect in the democratic journey which a country embarks. And this a lot happens in Africa and comes with a lot of price for stability and development and progress.
All right, very good. Professor John Edward Phillips, before I ask you the next question, would you like to make comments on what has been said previously?
There are many different understandings of Islam and Christianity, and in some of the understandings, the religion is compatible with democracy, and others it isn't. So I don't really have anything to add.
This is a essentially contested concept, as Dr. AMINU earlier said. Still talking about populism, I have listened to a lot of podcasts presented, especially on the BBC, BBC Radio 4, BBC World Service, and some of the things that they discussed in an in-depth manner is the difference between right-wing populism and left-wing populism. Dr. Amina had said something like, in Nigeria, we don't even care to know who is the leftist and who is the right-wing. Right-wing. Briefly explain to us, in the concept of the American politics, Professor John Edward Phillips, who are the left-wingers and who are the right-wingers? Then coming to the differences between left-wing populism and right-wing populism for us to clearly understand using American politics, especially the contemporary American politics, Republican versus Democrats.
Yeah, that's a really complex question because there's the economic left and the economic right, and there are social issues too, social liberals and social conservatives. I think AMINU KANO in Nigeria would have been an example of someone who was economically on the left but socially on the right. I think Christian democracy in Europe is a very similar thing. In the United States, things are getting much more polarized than they used to be, and people who try to walk that line or have some ideas on the left and some ideas on the right are finding it much harder. Now, going back to Donald Trump, one of the reasons he got the Republican nomination in 2016 is that he spoke out openly in favor of Social Security and Medicare, which are very important to older people in the United States, such as myself.
Are you talking about Obamacare?
Sorry?
Are you talking about Obamacare? Donald Trump opposed Obamacare?
No. Medicare is it's a single-payer health insurance program for the elderly. And in fact, one of the people in the United States who want to expand healthcare often talk about Medicare for all, which is a great slogan, but it's often not exactly what they have in mind. I mean, I know what Medicare means and I know what for all means, but then I was told by someone I was trying to discuss it with that that's not Medicare for all. It's some sort of gestalt. But I think there are certain characteristics of the United States that have to be kept in mind. One is the generalized mistrust of government, and particularly big government. And the Populist Party in the 1890s is a perfect example of that, because they wanted to expand government in many different ways. At the same time, they wanted to put brakes and controls on government. The Socialist Party in the United States was not a branch of the Fabian Socialists in the UK. They did not, except for a small Bellamyite faction, they did not want to nationalize the commanding heights of the economy. They were much more interested in workers' control and direct democracy at the workplace. The United States seems to be the only country where politicians can get elected by running against government. It's you know, but there is this fear of the government and of elites and of centralization. I think most Americans really can't imagine a unitary state. Most Americans I run into in Japan seem to assume that the prefectures in Japan are somewhat similar to an American state, and vice versa too. Many Japanese assume that the prefectures in Japan are similar to an American state, when in fact Japan is a unitary state. It's all the same state, and there is no sovereignty in the prefectures, as they're called. It's much more like an American county. I have a perfectly good example of how they make this mistake. British county is translated into Japanese with the same word that they use to translate an American state. It's a division of a country, and the idea of federalism is something that doesn't make any sense. The populists in the 1890s wanted state control of railroads and telegraphs, not nationalization. They wanted the states to take over. And again, there's this very strong decentralization idea. We actually tried to impose it on Japan after World War II, and it just didn't take at all. The few who noticed that we tried to do that thought we were trying to weaken Japan or cripple them, whereas was one of our ideas that just didn't take.
Okay. Much later, I'll ask you about the possibility of Donald Trump coming back in 2024. But AMINU HAYATU, still in the African context, even though you give us a very robust, comprehensive introduction, but I specifically want us to look at some African leaders, Nigeria inclusive, and evaluate them on their populist ideologies. For example, some people are suggesting that President Muhammadu Buhari, the former president of Nigeria, came in 2015 with some populist ideologies and rhetorics, and that's why he won. He was able to win. Atiku Abubakar is also thought by some people to be a populist who has some populist ideologies. I want you to look at the leaders that we have in Africa, and especially in Nigeria, and evaluate them based on their populist ideas, either partial populist ideology or complete populist ideology, if any.
Well, I don't want to completely believe that we just, wake up, and just begin to call anybody populist just because they are popular. There is a lot more to that, in terms of, because populism is a package, and many other elements have to be seen, present in a sort of movement populist movement, and this is very important. So I think that one of the important things we need to understand is that, of course, we normally have a popular, candidates contesting elections in Africa, and we have in Kenya, we have in Ghana, we have in Nigeria, and many other countries. But then the consciousness of the people as to drive populism is the most important thing, in the description of the exercise of populism in any polity. And I think that, yes, of course, popular candidates have the, ability to galvanize and rally, for people to rally around them based on, you could say, the fact that they are just charismatic leaders. I mean, recently, you saw what happened in KANO State, with the Kwankwasia movement. That's a sort of charismatic leader who is popular, but then I'm not sure if consciously the Kwankwasia movement knows or is aware that what they are doing is a strive in populism, and they have agenda, a course which they are pursuing, and then of course, but a lot of the use of rhetorics. The use of rhetorics is important. We have other groups that are even, because populism, a very broad definition of populism would have to involve, other non-political party, initiatives and activities. For example,
I'm sorry. I'm particularly interested in the issue of Rabi Musa Kwankwaso. Before you expand your explanation, some critics of Rabi Musa Kwankwaso and his movement suggest and believe that he has populist ideologies, populist elements in his rhetoric, the way he talks, the way he speaks to young people, young voters, especially at an emotional level. Look at his 2011 campaign when he returned as the governor of Kano, and look at what he has been doing, for example. I'm not saying that he's a bad guy, because we're not here to say that a populist politician is a bad guy. I know his voters might criticize me for saying that, but a lot of critics of his are suggesting that he has populist tendency, and that is what has given him so much popularity among young people, because poor people, the masses, are always interested in a politician who will rise and challenge the status quo, and he's simply good at that. Us versus the corrupt guys, us the virtuous versus the corrupt guys, that is them. What can you say about this?
Well, a sort of parochial understanding of populism would want to see that a charismatic leader, is being rallied around because of his interest in, serving the masses and carrying them along. But a populist movement is much more of that, because there are other elements like where does this ideologies emanate from? And mostly charismatic leaders in Africa, and indeed in Nigeria, are the ones who conceptualize and want to provide a view of how the masses would be galvanized and carried along. And masses, key into these ideas and begin to be interested in what they're doing. But in a more concretized populist understanding, it would have to be that these things emanate from the masses. They organize themselves, of course, in the process of evolving. Leaders evolve from the movement and the initiatives, and then things are taking shape. So that's why it's very important to really differentiate between, if a populist, would you call a top-down approach, a populist approach, for example, if it doesn't emanate from the grassroots. So it's very important that we have to always see that people, come across leaders who are charismatic, and they have this thoughts and rhetorics with them, which resonate with some of the things, wishes and aspirations of the people. There's no doubt about that, but it doesn't stop at that. So it's a really, a complex, a body of thoughts that need to be seen, be put in practice before we could actually clearly say that this is what it is. If you look at the Islamic movement in Nigeria, for example, the Shia movement under Ibrahim al-Zakzaki, that's a charismatic leader who is believed to, have the rhetorics to convince, more people to join the Islamic movement in Nigeria. And that's what has happened over time since the 1980s. In the split of with the relationship between the Sunni faction in that early time. So you could see that people become passionate, and the forces and interest in a nation state, have a role to play in determining the nature and practices of populism. In Nigeria, everyone knows that the history of Nigeria is characterized by a lot of turbulence, political turbulence, economic, dislocations, across regimes, and sort of problems within societal strata. So this has really pushed the people, to the extreme, to the margins, of democratic practices, to the extent that any small, anybody who comes with something to offer to the people, in terms of salvaging their situation, people really, resonate with that and, pick into that movement. But it doesn't necessarily that, people understand and define, that's why at some point, most of these movements, you see them, even if they are political parties, by the time they don't get access to power, or even by the time they get access to power, you really don't seem to see the continuity of this hegemonic struggle, from the grassroots that has been started, and at some point it ends as quickly as it started.
Yeah, well,
Professor John Edward Phillips.
Defining populism again. What is populism?
Yes, it's really confusing and complicated. Have you got a word to utter? Or we can move on.
What, me?
Professor,
I'm not
Professor
sure how
John.
I would, as a historian, I don't have to define populism in the present, and I can limit it to the People's Party in the 1890s in the United States. And it's a very interesting movement that had a lot of ramifications and effects in later history. I might add, let me mention something that happened during the Biafra War in Nigeria. The Abakoya Rebellion of farmers is a very similar rural-based, bottom-up type of movement. Now, in that case, it was an actual rebellion. It wasn't a ballot box political party movement, but you have this similar force of, something coming up from the grassroots, and particularly from rural areas. And that is very similar to the original populism in the United States.
Okay. So let me ask you this question. The main topic of this program is not what is populism, because we cannot define it, it's complicated. But is populism, especially the one that we are seeing, or we have been seeing the past few years, is it a threat to democracy, or is it just a development to democracy? Professor John Edward Phillips.
Yeah, okay. You want me to?
Yeah. Well, yeah.
That's hard to say. I mean, both the left populists and the right populists will accuse each other of being threats to democracy. Now, it's a problem for Bernie Sanders because your average American probably couldn't tell the difference between socialist and communist if their life depended on it. So a lot of people routinely smear him as being communist. I wish we had our European still in the group, because of course in Europe there's a very clear and obvious distinction between socialists and communists, whereas in the United States there really aren't enough of either one for people to become familiar with them. Now Sanders is very much a democratic socialist. He's not an authoritarian. He doesn't want to lock up the opposition. Trump, on the other hand, has openly called for the termination. That was his term, termination of the United States Constitution. And a lot of people who worked with him in his term of office have become very alarmed and are appearing on the American media to warn that he does intend to end democracy. Certainly, the original populism was not a threat to democracy. It was expanding democracy. It was suppressed largely by ending the black franchise, removing blacks from the voting rolls and blacks from Congress. So that it was the opposition to populism that was anti-democratic. But democracy is a very unpredictable.
Okay, of course, I have heard a lot of experts, analysts, making a connection, either direct or indirect connection between authoritarianism and populism. For example, the Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi has been linked to, who has been dubbed by his critics as an internationalist leader. Linked, he was feared that he was sliding. There were fears that he was sliding into authoritarianism. The Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan is also accused by his critics to be an authoritarian leader after being a populist leader, as some experts put it. I don't understand. Help me wrap my head around this fact that is populism in any way related to authoritarianism?
I would say no, and I'm not sure how you consider Modi to be a populist. Yes, he's a charismatic leader, but he seems to represent the upper caste Hindus. He's not particularly interested in traditional family farming. He's rather a modernizer in terms of economics. I don't see the relationship between Modi and populism at all.
But his critics say
people use populism in this very loose sense without defining it. And I think if we're going to talk about populism, we really have to define what we mean when we talk about it. Yes, it is complex, but there should be some consistent elements.
Yeah. Okay, Dr. Aminu Hayatu, I want you to briefly answer these two questions. Is populism a threat to democracy? But what is more, the question that is much more recent is this relationship between populism and authoritarianism. Do you have something to add up on this?
Well, I think it's they might be interpreted in many contexts as two opposite ends, and I don't think that because for any government to be authoritarian, it has to have this element of elitist, handling of things, and the position would be from top to bottom rather than the other way around. Which, most importantly, authoritarianism could also happen within a populist movement, activity. When people, even among themselves, the common people, the masses, organize themselves, even in labor relations, what we call the aristocratic labor aristocracy. When members of the labor union organize, and then suddenly, people become leaders of the movement, grow to become stronger of the unions, and then are dictating on the activities of the movement. It also happens with, the level at which, populist, movements and activities operate, because sometimes, you see some level of dictation, in the selling out of the activity, as activities are folding and decisions are being taken. Most of the time when there is authoritarianism in populist activities, it's when those leading populist movements or ideologies actually seem to derail, from the nectars of taking common decisions among themselves, and when decisions are cornered and authorized by some who feel that they are entitled to take decisions on behalf of the larger masses without some form of consultations. So that also happens at that level. But if it is inter level, then it means between populist movements and the government. authoritarianism also is identified on the part of the government, and when there is clamp down on rise-ups or organizing of the people against certain ideologies of the government, or decisions or policies or even programs, that can be quite authoritarian, and the result would be to undermine such populist movements, and may not see results in terms of what they seek to what they aspire to achieve in relation to the governance process of their own country.
Okay, so we are drawing towards the end of the program. Professor, I think I'm going to ask you one final question. Professor, I asked you earlier about populism and its relations with democracy, whether it's a threat or a blessing or something. Now, looking at one of the characteristics of populism, saying that the populist leaders or populist politicians always are against, anti-establishment, are against the elites. For example, Donald Trump is an example. Can we say that when Donald Trump spent the 4 years that he did as the US president, he championed the grievances of the masses. He championed what the masses wanted him to achieve, for example. Analyzed his presidency based on this.
Well, I'm not sure that he did champion the interests of the masses. And again, it's one of the things that does connect him with the original populist movement is his strong rural base of support. But his major legislative accomplishment was a tax cut for the rich.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm not sure how that fits into an anti-establishment or anti-elite.
Well, he came during his campaign with rhetorics that they were going to the wall and they are going to cut funding. Like America would stop, under his presidency, would stop funding alliances like NATO, the WHO, and other stuff like that. He was one that said America should stop spending billions of dollars or trillions of dollars in a war like that of Afghanistan, for example. Something like that.
Yeah, but where's the wall? I mean, he said it was not only was he going to build a wall, but Mexico was going to pay for it, which is
did that happen?
No, there's no wall, and Mexico didn't pay for it. It's I'm having a hard time trying to figure out what he did. Part of it was his total lack of political experience. And I wouldn't call him, he certainly doesn't come up from the grassroots. He was born into a very wealthy family. He's had trouble holding on to the money that he inherited, but he wasn't very effective because he really didn't know what he was doing. There was an interview with him where he expressed shock that he didn't realize that being president of the United States was a difficult job. He had no idea how hard it was going to be. And wow. Because the guy, he's never been in government, he's never been in the military. And every president before him has either been in government service, not necessarily elective office. Some of them have been cabinet ministers, not ministers, secretaries. Starting to talk British, I'm sure, but
yes.
Yeah, he has never held elective office. He's never been in public service. He's never been in the military. Several presidents have been had military experience, but not elective office. Grant, Eisenhower, and others, but he really didn't know what he was doing. And this is people who are raising the alarm about a possible other term for him, a second term, are saying this time he's going to come back and he's going to know how to do what he wants to do. But he hasn't I don't, can you name an accomplishment of other than tax cuts for the rich? What did he do?
I mean, Professor, maybe because you are a Democrat, that is why you seem to have a hard time trying to figure out what he has achieved.
Okay, then that's why I'm asking you. Okay, I understand that I'm biased as a Democrat. I don't like him, but objectively, what did he accomplish?
Okay, under his presidency, as he claimed when he was in power, the U.S. economy was booming. It boomed, as he said, and his people were also of the opinion that under his presidency, the economy was stable, was improving.
Well, this is a thing. The Americans will take the presidential election as a referendum on the economy, when the direct control of the president over the economy is not that great. I mean, the business cycle goes on no matter who's the president. And I remember when I was young, people would blame President Herbert Hoover, for causing the Great Depression. Well, first of all, the Great Depression was a worldwide phenomenon. It wasn't just the United States. And second of all, it's part of this boom-bust business cycle that the president doesn't really have that much control over. Now, you can blame him for what he did or didn't do in response to the Depression, but he didn't cause that. And the same thing with the Great Recession that that happened at the end of Bush Jr.'s second term. He wasn't responsible for that. In fact, a lot of the causes of that Great Recession went back to the Clinton boom years. Because again, you're starting to get more extreme booms and busts. After World War II, you had a pretty strict Keynesian counter-cyclical fiscal and monetary policies. So you had pretty steady economic growth in the post-war years. But
so are you saying that Trump inherited?
He's not responsible for the stock market. He's not responsible for the interest rates. The interest rates are set by the Federal Reserve Board, and the president has no direct control over that. If the economy goes into another recession, yes, Americans will blame the president, no matter who it is, whether they're Democrat or Republican, and the president's not really responsible for that.
To be clear, are you saying that President Trump inherited a booming economy from Obama?
Yeah, Obama was, I think he handled the economy he was given very well. But again, it was going to recover after the crash, what I call the panic of 2008, because it was a stereotypical financial panic. Europe, they went too deep into austerity, I think, and had a more difficult time coming out of the Great Recession than the United States did. But Obama was basically riding the economy, and that boom continued straight through from Obama into Trump. And if you're going to credit Trump for it, you have to give Obama at least as much credit. And frankly, neither of them had that much objectively to do with the ups and downs of the business cycle. They are responsible for how they react to it, what they do about it. But they don't create the conditions.
All right. Okay. Dr. Aminu Hayatu, your final words. We have talked a lot. Even though there are so many questions I was not able to ask, especially about how populist politicians use social media to interact directly with the followers. Donald Trump is an example. President Muhammadu Buhari, former president of Nigeria, was an example in 2015, for example. Obama in 2008, even though he's not characterized as a populist politician, but he used Facebook in 2008 to connect to voters, and that, as analysts say and believe, gave him a lot of popularity. Dr. Aminu Hayatu, we are not able to talk about all those things, but your final words as a conclusion.
Well, no, I just want us to, I mean, as we go on, to think and speak about populism, it's very important we understand context as they are different, because it affects, people's understanding and their consciousness of what populism means to them, especially with the civilized democracies and compared to African democracies, there's a lot of disparities in that and differences that calls for, contextual understanding of the issues. And we just need to, articulate this very well in relation to whatever happens. A lot of different, variants of democratic practices are emerging the world over. Okay, what reference are you going to make, for example, to the green revolution, to the yellow revolution, blue revolutions, and all those revolutions in the Eastern Europe that took place at that time. And then, of course, the wave of democracy that swept the African continent. And then, of course, the retarding of the wheel of democracy that we're currently experiencing due to military coups. And then, of course, the uprisings that we're experiencing in Europe, and then the contestation that are happening right there in the United States of America. All of this put together, really further makes the concept of populism very much more complex, and to unbundle that, we need specifications in terms of what practices happen. And so it's very important, but it's a very interesting thing, and it's evolving. Even in democracies in Africa, we're experiencing, the organization, of the common people, and rising up against dictatorial tendencies and or popular policies and programs by their governments, which is an indication that something is really generating, on the ground, and has a reflection in the relations of governance between the governors and the governed. And of course, the recent, democratic protection, and opening of the hitherto shrinked space, democratic space that we saw.
Well, thank you very much, gentlemen. Professor John Edward Phillips, Emeritus Professor of History from HIROSAKI, or at HIROSAKI University, who recently came back from San Francisco to attend a summit. Welcome home. Thank you very much for being on the show. Dr. AMINU HAYATU from BAYERO University, KANO. Thank you very much for honoring the invitation. Yeah, and I want to, in absentia, thank thank Professor Daniele Albertazzi for speaking to us in the first half of the program. It really means a lot to me. My name is Umar Isa Dandago. On behalf of everyone that has contributed to the production of the show, I'm saying goodbye and see you very soon.